Hi, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on advancing the Sustainable Development Goals in your community. My name is Laura Schnurr. I'm the Director of Community Climate Transitions here at Tamarack Institute, and I'm supported by my colleagues Connor and Jorge today. As we welcome you to this session, we'd like to acknowledge the history of the lands on which we gather. So we're all joining virtually, of course, and calling in from many locations. So I'd invite everyone on the call to reflect on the place you're joining in from today and your relationship to that place. I myself am a settler in the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanen'kehá:ka Mohawk people, colonially known as Montreal. Both I as an individual and Tamarack as an organization are committed to advancing reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and we strive to do so with humility, love, and respect. And since we're speaking about the SDGs today, let's take a moment and reflect on if and how the SDG framework can help us advance reconciliation in Canada. There's been much debate about this over the past years, and from what I can tell, the consensus is that the SDGs are useful, but they're not the be-all and end-all. So the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, and the final report on of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, among others, help paint a fuller picture of the work we need to do in Canada. Yet the SDGs and their tagline, "Leave no one behind," are also seen by many as key in advancing reconciliation. A couple quick reminders. We'll be sharing the slides, the recording, and links and resources from today's call with everyone attending after the session. We invite you to use the Q&A panel on your Zoom and submit questions there that you have for any of the panelists. We'll be getting to those towards the end of the call. And if you have any questions, need technical support, feel free to shoot us a message in the chat. So now it'd be great to get to know who's on our call. We'd welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat box by sharing your name, your organization, and where you're calling in from. That would be wonderful. So maybe take a moment to do that and we can see who we have on the call. I know from the registrant list, we had people from really across sectors, across Canada and globally as well. So it's quite a diverse group here with us. In terms of the agenda today, we'll be speaking with, we have several guest speakers and panelists, and we'll be hearing from Tony Pippa to start with from Brookings, who's going to really help set the context and the stage for the conversation today. Then we'll be launching our 10 guide. This is a brand new publication on advancing the SDGs in your community, the topic of today's conversation. And we'll be providing some highlights from the guide. We'll then be hearing from 4 communities that are featured in the guide and really diving into those stories. And we have individuals from each of those communities with us. And then we'll have some Q&A before we close. Thank you for everyone who's jumping in here with introductions. Great to see people really from all over. I'm going to share with you all, as mentioned, this brand new publication that we've just launched. I just popped in the chat box, so we do welcome you to scroll through that during the conversation today. We'll also be following up with a link afterwards, so you can check it out on your own time later. So before I turn it over to our first speaker, Tony, I just wanted to share a bit about the SDGs and the 2030 agenda to help set the context. So if you're joining this call today, you probably already have some familiarity with the SDGs. In a nutshell, there are 17 goals, 169 targets, 231 indicators. It's a common vision and shared language for humanity, a universal agenda for everyone, everywhere. And the goals are really interrelated and indivisible. So what's really interesting in the goals is not so much the individual boxes, but really the spaces between them. They help give us an opportunity to look holistically at the challenges we face and look at the linkages between the social, environmental, and economic challenges. They also allow for multi-solving. So catalytic actions can spur progress across multiple targets and goals. There's also inherent synergies and trade-offs between the goals. So action taken on one goal may have positive or negative effects and impacts on others. It's an ambitious and urgent agenda. There's 9 years left to go. And according to the Sustainable Development Report, Canada as a whole has only achieved 1 of the 17 SDGs, with some remaining challenges on 7 of the goals, significant challenges for 6, and major challenges for the remaining 3. And perhaps most importantly for today's conversation, it is a high-level framework that needs to be localized. So this conversation today is really about how do we ground the SDGs in communities and localize them. We will kick off the conversation today with remarks from Tony Pippa, who is a senior fellow with the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings and one of the world's leading experts on the SDGs. Tony's also provided a foreword for the 10 guide that I mentioned that's being released today. You can read his full bio on the event page. So I won't read that out to you, but you're welcome to take a look there. I will drop it in the chat box as well. But let me start, Tony, by just asking if you could share with us why the SDGs are a useful framework at the local level, and in what ways communities are showing leadership on the SDGs.
Thanks, Laura. It's wonderful to be here today, and I'm always excited to be able to talk about the SDGs, and especially about what's happening locally on the SDGs. As you mentioned, they're ambitious, they're interconnected, and they provide a framework really for thinking about how the challenges and opportunities that we face as a world are interconnected and how they might need to be thought of and taken on at once. Now, this was an agenda that was agreed to under the auspices of the UN. And so, you know, specifically, they are actually meant and measured at the national and global levels. But as you say, there are local leaders that are taking this on, and it begs the question why. And I think the first point of entry there is that local leaders, mayors, people involved in their communities, especially as you come out of recovery from COVID, where you're looking at issues of public health and community well-being, you're looking at reducing inequality and what was exposed by the pandemic. You're looking at thinking about what an economic transformation might need to look like so that we're taking action on climate change and transitioning our sources of energy and other things. All those are issues that local leaders and local citizens, frankly, want to make progress on. And the SDGs provides a way to be thinking about that holistically, but by thinking about it as at a local level. Like, what are the local priorities? What's unique to people's communities and localities that they feel like they need to be making some progress on? The SDGs offer both a North Star and a discipline that requires evidence and measurement to understand what your progress is looking like on that. But at the very basic level, offers an opportunity to solve local problems, but make a global contribution. And frankly, national governments are sometimes challenged with the interdependence of the SDGs because it requires, you know, as you said, sort of thinking along several dimensions at once and how to create policy interventions to do that. Where at the local level, it's where you can more concretely sort of use them to create specific solutions for specific people in specific places. And it's a positive agenda that your citizens can be excited about because it not only helps you solve local problems, but it makes this global contribution.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm curious to hear more about how you've seen this play out. Like, where is their leadership on this at local and regional governments, or maybe outside of government? We know there's a lot of leadership from community organizations. How are you seeing that?
So we started to recognize and notice, nodes of activity happening soon after the SDGs were agreed upon in 2015. And at Brookings, we actually convened what we call the SDG Leadership Cities Group. So it's a set of senior government officials from across the world that, were what I would say early movers. They saw the SDGs as potentially having value to their local communities and started to think about how to translate this national and global agenda to the local level. The one thing I think is really inspiring about what happens at the local level is that it's really an innovation agenda. Like doing this at the local level is in and of itself innovative, right? It wasn't necessarily made with local stakeholders, local governments, local businesses, universities, others in mind. But you have things like New York City, which took the idea, first off, they did a city strategy that they rolled out at around the same time the SDGs were created around 2015. And they said, what we're actually reflecting and what we're trying to achieve as a city is pretty reflective of the SDGs. So they did an alignment exercise and they sort of mapped and then created goals for themselves coming out of the SDGs. And a couple of years later said, we ought to assess what our progress looks like on this. It'll hold ourselves more accountable. We'll be able to understand how well we're making progress. And so they took the idea of the national reviews that countries do at the UN and they said, why don't we do that locally? And so they did what they've called the first voluntary local review. And that since has turned into a movement really globally. And we now have more than 100 cities and local governments that have done a voluntary local review. And a couple more hundred signed up and committed to do them. And they're doing them in different ways. They're doing it based on their own local context, the data that they have locally, the challenges that are specific to their own localities. And you mentioned sort of, it's not just the governments themselves, but what the SDGs actually really provide, and you see the business sector, you see universities, you see philanthropy, you see civil society, as they become aware of the SDGs, really see it also as a guiding star and a common language for them. So then it becomes like this common platform by which different stakeholders at the local level can come together and sort of collect and mobilize their comparative advantages to work together on shared priorities. And we see partnerships popping up all over the place, everything from what LA is doing on gender equity with a set of universities and businesses, to what Bristol in the UK is doing in creating an economic board that has their local business leaders and other local stakeholders at the table and helping the city think through what the economic recovery from COVID looks like.
My next question is, what do you find most encouraging right now when it comes to the efforts to localize the SDGs, and what do we need to do a better job of? And you just spoke to partnerships, and I wonder if all those encouraging partnerships across sectors is maybe it's the most encouraging, or if there's something else.
So I think the partnerships are very encouraging and inspiring, and it's providing a way for different stakeholders to come together and in some respects have a collective plan, take some collective actions and have collective impact. I also think it's really interesting to see how excited citizens get about this. Because frankly, when we think about the challenges that the world overall faces, it seems big and giant and way out there, right? But this allows citizens, and you have a place like Mannheim, Germany, where they literally did focus groups and surveying of their local citizens, and it provided them a way for citizens to participate in where they felt like the city could be making progress. And as they do that, they feel like they're making a global contribution as well. And so that positive agenda and their ability to impact that, I think, is really inspiring. What we can do better at, one is awareness. I mean, levels of awareness, especially in North America, Canada, and the US, the SDGs can remain low, especially in the general populace. I think the other thing, and it comes back to that idea of partnerships, is, financing models aren't set up to be comprehensive or to sort of fit together and package together in the way that the SDGs require. And so I think still putting together the resources, especially the financial resources, can be a challenge to do the kind of multi-solving that you were talking about that the SDGs provide a basis for, and sort of require us to think in a different mindset about.
Fantastic. One last question for you, Tony. Brookings has been developing fantastic resources over the last years, including the City Playbook for advancing the SDGs, Next Generation Urban Planning on producing voluntary local reviews, and the 17 Rooms, which is an engagement approach developed by Brookings and Rockefeller. And it's a neat tool for communities, cities, universities, and others to use. It's also featured in the 10 Guide, one of the top 10 resources. Can you tell us a bit more about just where people can follow your work and sort of how you see Brookings' role in this?
Yeah, so we feel like our role is to help connect innovations that are happening across different places, and then sort of take those innovations and best practices and share them more widely, sort of make them open source. And so some of the tools that you're suggesting, for example, our Cities Playbook and our 17 Rooms, which we're actually even developing a guidebook for, just to make them available so that they can be applied and used as the basis for other localities. And I think you see that widely happening. I mean, I think that's why the 10 Ideas Guide is so exciting, because we want to create a real ecosystem, I think, of tools and accessories, and just get people sharing their how-tos. Like, how did they do this? What were the challenges they overcame? And get them in conversation with each other. That is one thing that the SDGs have been really powerful for, is exchange across boundaries. Like the SDG Leadership Cities group we have has cities from the Global South, cities from the United States, sharing back and forth as peers, without there being a division developing. And the SDGs are a really good platform for that. I'll pop into the chat the link to our local leadership on the SDGs initiative, which then points to other resources. But I think that I'm so excited about the 10 Ideas Guide, because it's a resource guide that enables that as well. So congratulations. Great. And kudos.
Thank you, Tony. And thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Most appreciate your work on this. So we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
So now we are going to take a few moments to actually just walk through some of the highlights from the guide. So we started this work here at Tamarack by putting together an advisory group of 12 SDG leaders and practitioners from across Canada. Really diverse group of folks working at local, regional, national levels and from across sectors. And this group really provided the content for the guide, helped with the editing process and everything, and we're super involved. The next 4 speakers we're going to hear from today are actually among these 12 individuals, and they're all doing exemplary work in the community. So the first section of the guide, and I'd encourage you to actually read these questions from the guide itself, but here they are. In the guide itself, you also have a section to kind of rate how you're doing on a scale of 1 to 5 with each of these, and then add up the total score, and sort of you get a score on how ready you are to implement the SDGs locally. But a couple of these questions are around your own familiarity, both your own familiarity of your organizations and your community at large. As Tony mentioned, awareness is still quite low among the general population, and so that's a key one. How your community, has your community developed a long-term vision already? Is this something that could be mapped to the SDGs? Another question is around whether you have a strong and diverse network of people and organizations who could form a coalition to really advance this work. Then there's a question of whether you know who in your community is most at risk of being left behind and why. Have you developed relationships and partnerships needed to welcome in and center the voices of vulnerable communities? Is there sufficient trust across sectors and between community members for people to have open and honest conversations? Does your community use data to track and report on progress on local goals? Do they align well with the SDGs? Are there regular opportunities for your community to participate in planning, monitoring, and review? And do you know who in your network might have access to resourcing? Again, something Tony raised on the importance of resourcing and funding this work. The next section, this is one of the most exciting alongside the stories, is the really good ideas. So these are ideas for how to advance the SDGs in your community. Raising awareness is super key. We talked about that. Broad community engagement necessary to do so. Consult on local priorities to develop a shared vision for your community. Understand how your community is already doing against the existing SDG targets and indicators to see where there's success and where we might need additional action prioritization. Aligning existing local plans, perhaps the local city or region has plans that could be aligned with the global goals, the SDGs. We also have seen communities developing action plans for priority goals that are related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Invite diverse voices to lead and offer support to enable participation. Identify meaningful indicators that resonate with your community to measure progress, because not all of the targets and indicators are relevant. And this is something we're going to hear in some presentations later in this webinar. Conduct a voluntary local review. Tony referred briefly to voluntary local reviews, or VLRs, and how many places around the world are stepping up and producing these. And again, we have someone on the call today who's produced Canada's first VLR, so we'll hear more about that. Track progress through an open and transparent approach, and share stories from your community to inspire and connect with others. The 10 stories section, these are mostly within Canada. There's a couple of international examples, but these are really communities that are putting those ideas into practice, and they're exemplary communities who are leading on the SDGs. And so today, with us today, we have someone from Kelowna, Winnipeg, London, Ontario, and from Quebec, who will be speaking to some of these stories. But as you can see, there's a diverse number of ideas that these stories represent. The useful resources section, we picked top 10 resources. There are so many great resources out there for communities localizing the goals, and it was really hard to narrow it down to 10, but we found 10 that are a combination of Canadian ones, some global and international ones, some coming from government. You can see the StatsCan has produced some great data resources, and others from the community sector. So really diverse set of resources here, and they're all available with the links in the guide itself and with descriptions for each. Aussi, on a des ressources en français. On a le guide 10, c'est en français aussi. Today's webinar is in English, but we have the guide available in French, and we'll be doing other events in French to support Francophone communities. But these additional resources are available in the French version of the guide. And yeah, the last section in the guide is 10 ways to get started. So there's just some tips around communities who are just starting out with this, and it might seem overwhelming. They can look at those and just feel like there's some tangible things they can do to really get moving. So we are now going to move on to hear from, as I said, some of the communities that are showing great leadership on the SDGs. These 4 panelists today are all members of the advisory group that helped co-create the guide as well. So we will be hearing from Kusum, Stefan, Liliana, Luis. Again, I won't be reading full bios. They are available on the event page if you'd like to take a look. But Kusum is Wijasekera. I will just introduce your role briefly. You were the author and project manager of Kelowna's voluntary local review, which was published earlier this year in April, I believe. And this was Canada's first voluntary local review. There have been, as Tony said, over 100 around the world, and this was Canada's first. So really excited to hear about your experience. So welcome, Kusum.
Thanks, Laura. I'm excited to be part of this event as the Tengai gets launched. I just want to take a moment to thank you and also Tamarack for including me to be part of the advisory group. We started the Kelowna VLR about 4 years ago when localizing SDGs was a relatively new concept in Canada. And in all honesty, it was a bit overwhelming just to start. So with this 10 guide, it captures information and stories from across Canada and different learning experiences. So I think it helps organize your thoughts and have the confidence to start the process. So that's why I'm excited to be here. So let's begin. All right, next slide. So the agenda for today is basically, I'll just be discussing the approach for Kelowna, and I'll talk a little bit about what leaving no one behind meant to us. And before I continue, I just want to mention, so we carried the Kelowna VLR as a third-party review by GECO and BCCIC, but we worked in collaboration with the City of Kelowna and more specifically with the Department of Policy and Planning. Next slide, please. So Kelowna is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx or Okanagan peoples. It's one of the fastest growing cities in Canada. And as you can see from the stats, the population is increasing and it will increase by more than 35% in the coming 20 years. So the city is evolving, the economy is diversifying, neighborhoods are changing, and urbanization can be exciting because it brings about more employment and educational opportunities. But at the same time, it can introduce things such as increased traffic, escalating housing prices, and make it more challenging to meet everyone's needs. And this is where a VLR can kind of help link everything together. Next slide, please. So we started the VLR process by identifying projects that had already localized SDGs in a Canadian, but also international context. And it was mentioned earlier on, SDGs have 169 targets and 232 indicators. And like I mentioned, it can be overwhelming and intimidating just to start. So for us to help overcome this, we looked at research that was already conducted. So we looked at Brookings Institute. They had a report where they took the 169 targets and they narrowed it down to 78 measurable targets relevant to a Canadian context. Then we looked at organizations and research conducted by BCCIC, as well as IISD, to understand the direction Canada was headed with the SDGs so that we can kind of narrow it down to the relevant targets and indicators. We also looked at organizations such as World Council on City Data and to see how they align indicators with the SDGs. And then we looked at existing VLRs. And with this research, what we did was we carried out two approaches simultaneously. So with the first one, we looked at the sustainability agenda already underway in Kelowna. And so what that entailed was looking at some of the municipal planning documents. So we took OCPs, climate action plans, and we extracted the targets and indicators and aligned them with the 169 targets and 232 indicators. The second approach is highlighted on the next slide. With this approach, we started with the 169 targets and 232 indicators, and we looked at available subnational data in Canada. And we did this by reviewing federal and provincial sustainable strategies. We also reviewed reports from researchers, academia, and then we had numerous conversations with civil society organizations, and they helped us identify targets, data, but also information gaps. The SDGs cover such a broad spectrum of issues. In order to ensure we capture different voices and perspectives, we had to make sure to communicate with numerous types of organizations and obtain quantitative and qualitative data. The next slide identifies the next step in our process, which was to analyze the TRC calls to action and align them with the SDGs. So in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada came out with a final report on the history and impact of Canada's genocide on Indigenous peoples. As settlers on Turtle Island, we have an obligation to listen, empathize, and redress the current unequal powers that exist in Canada today. Canada has a history of colonization, slavery, and discrimination, and it's important to understand whether consciously or subconsciously, these are reflected in many of our social and economic policies. So throughout our VLR process, the team consulted with different Indigenous organizations to try and understand what meaningful impact at a community scale looks like. And this wasn't an easy process because in Canada, many Indigenous communities and peoples have been the recipients of tokenized gestures, dishonest actions, and empty promises. And while today the conversations around indigeneity and race are changing in powerful ways, empathizing requires us to reflect on whether the outcomes have actually changed, because increasing awareness doesn't equate to outcomes improving. Leaving no one behind to us meant we had to engage in numerous uncomfortable conversations, and we had to admit our ignorance, and we had to understand that, you know what, maybe our process wasn't right. Maybe we have to change it, and maybe we have to go back a bit. Because as Canada moves forward towards reconciliation, we must reflect and assess our personal biases, and we must listen to empathize and understand rather than listening to respond. So the final step of our process is on our next slide. We basically took all the targets and indicators from both approaches and the TRC calls to action and amalgamated them and grouped them under the different goals. So then we took one of the goals, and then we basically had conversations with experts in the field, and we discussed shortcomings as well as benefits. And we thought about questions such as, is the indicator measuring what it should be? Who is being captured, but also who is being left behind? And then finally, we looked at the feasibility of each indicator. Municipalities have limited resources, so instead of coming up with new indicators, we looked at the possibility of supplementing some of their existing indicators. And then we went through this iterative process for all 17 goals until we finalized a set of 28 community level indicators for Kelowna. Thank you.
Thanks, Kusum. That was great. It's really neat to see the process you went through, because I think a lot of communities who are looking into doing VLRs, and Winnipeg, who are, we're about to hear from Stefan, is one of them. And it's just really useful for people to see this kind of blueprint, right? Like, it's been done before in Canada once so far, and people can use that to inform their own processes. So we will hopefully come back to you at the Q&A session, but we're now going to move to Stefan, who's our next speaker. Stefan Jungkurt is the lead of SDG indicators and data with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Thank you for joining us today, Stefan. Over to you.
Thanks, Laura. And like Kusum, I wanted to thank you for including me in the advisory group, and also for your great work in pulling this 10 guide together. I think this is really exactly what we need at this point for the SDGs in Canada. I will be speaking about Winnipeg Pick, but I'm actually calling in from Gatineau today, which is located on the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and the Algonquin people. This hasn't, I'm fortunate to live here with my family today, but this hasn't always been my home. I'm actually, I grew up at a place very close by the city of Mannheim that Tony mentioned earlier on. So one of the great things about the SDGs is also that it helps bridging distances, because you get to work in different places. And I do tend to say we when I talk about Winnipeg, even though I've never lived there, but that's just a reflection of the great colleagues I have there and the great community leaders I've had the pleasure of working with over the last couple of years. So I very quickly talk about sort of our preceding work that we've done in Winnipeg before the SDGs came around, because we were fortunate to be able to build our voluntary local review that we're currently working on almost a decade of work with the community there. So in 2009, IISD formed a partnership with the United Way of Winnipeg, a local charity, basically to solve the question is, how do we know whether we're making progress with our work? How do we know whether we're having impact? This general idea led to several rounds of consultations and ended up in the development of a set of indicators, of community indicators that we were going to use our work to measure the impact of our work, which were really based on what the community wanted to see and to use for measuring progress. Then in 2013, we moved those community indicators online with the first platform that we call the Pick platform. And 4 years later, in 2017, this platform had kind of come to the point where we needed a major overhaul. And we also realized that there was growing interest in Winnipeg to connect this local work to the SDGs. So we used that as an opportunity to build kind of a new version of the platform, which is much simpler to use, which makes that link with the community indicators to the SDGs, but also has a larger focus on communication. So we realized really that all the core of that data work really is that you want to be able to tell stories based on that data and inspire action in the community. And in that process, we also developed a template that we can now use to help other communities to do similar work. That's what we call the Tracking Progress platform, which is also featured in the 10 guide as one of the resources. So I'm going to very quickly give you the rapid version of the tour of what the PEG platform is. So you should be seeing, one second, you should be seeing a website now with a beautiful picture of the Assiniboine and Red River where they meet. It's called the Forks in Winnipeg. So this is the homepage. Just very quickly, if you go to the About page, you can see Winnipeg's land acknowledgement. And now I see a blank screen. I hope this is not. That's new. That's never happened before. I'm sorry. Okay, I will skip the presentation. My Firefox just crashed. I don't know what happened there. But just very quickly, what I will share the link actually to the website. So you can follow along there and just take a look whenever you have a chance. But basically what the PEG website is, it is a collection of indicator themes that you can see on the left-hand side, where you see the original indicators that were chosen by Winnipeggers to measure progress in Winnipeg. And for each indicator, you can pull up 4 components: a description page that tells a bit the story of why is this indicator important. Then there is a tab with a graph where you can see either a bar graph or a line graph or some easy visualization of the indicator data that's being shown there. One of the things that I like to show is if you just go into a very simple indicator like median household income, you can see immediately how that level of income differs in different neighborhoods of Winnipeg. But then the third tab is for some indicators, we're actually putting a map. So you can see a map of Winnipeg there, and you can see how those different neighborhoods compare. And in the example that I like to show in the median household income, you can see very, very quickly how strong those inequalities are in Winnipeg if you take that as sort of a core indicator of inequality and distribution of income. And then the fourth tab, that's kind of where the magic comes in. That's where we show the link to the relevant SDGs and the SDG targets. So instead of kind of going back to the people in Winnipeg to say, well, you know, the SDGs are required these new indicators, we said, no, let's keep what we have and then connect it to the SDGs so we can show how the progress that's being made in Winnipeg contributes to these global goals. And this has been working very well in terms of raising awareness of the SDGs in Winnipeg. So the SDGs are now included in the new Our Winnipeg plan, which is Winnipeg's Sustainable Development Plan, including the link to PEG. It's also being used for the Higher Needs Assessment, which is a plan to determine sort of measures against poverty and so on. And it's also part of Winnipeg's Climate Action Plan. So those are kind of some of the areas where PEG has been making an impact. And now, if you remember the years that I said, you know, we started in 2009, 2013 was the first PEG, 2017. So we do these 4-year milestones. So of course, 2021 was our year to say, well, let's use what we've done in Winnipeg as a basis for creating Winnipeg's first voluntary local review. So what we did now is we used both the data work that we have, but also the engagement that we have in Winnipeg. So we have an advisory group through which we very regularly communicate with community leaders and civil society organizations in Winnipeg to develop a methodology to say, can we build a voluntary local review on this work? And what we decided to do was to basically group the indicators that we have in Winnipeg, in PEG, under certain SDGs, and then see, where is Winnipeg at with regard to those SDGs, and then to scan what kind of policies, what kind of action is already happening in Winnipeg. So you can see where Winnipeg is at in the VLR, and then what is Winnipeg doing right now. And then we interviewed some community organizations that are working on these issues to say, well, what's your story? What's your perspective on poverty, for example, or on health, on education in Winnipeg? And all of these sort of components, we regularly touch base with our advisory committee, which we expanded for the voluntary local review. Yeah, we're now at the stage where we have a final draft. And actually, as we're speaking, my team is sort of very busy preparing for the last meeting with the advisory committee for the voluntary local review. If things go well, we'll launch it at the end of November. Yeah, hopefully you'll be able to take a look at it then. So now, what have we learned in this process? And of course, one thing that's really interesting is, of course, it does help a lot if this pre-existing indicator work that we had in Winnipeg, but it also has a bit of a disadvantage because our engagement is quite old, right? It's been more than 10 years that we had this very, very large effort to bring everybody in and to see if we're all on the same page. So we realized that it's really high time to redo this original engagement, not just to reaffirm the consensus of, yeah, these are the priorities for Winnipeg, but also because we realized that we're really falling behind on the work that Kusum mentioned with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and sort of the building of partnerships with Indigenous organizations in Winnipeg. So that's something that we've already written on our agenda for the next iteration of the VLR. And some other things that we realized, of course, since PEG was developed before the SDGs were around, there are some SDGs that are not very well covered with the current PEG indicators. One of them is climate change. So even though climate change is utmost important for Winnipeg, like for most other cities, we don't actually have the right indicators to track activities on climate change at this point. But those are kind of the things that we came out and we're in a similar position as Kusum and as the VLR in Kelowna. Of course, we're a third-party engagement process here. So we are not the ones who can set targets. And we realize that targets are really, really important to be able to measure progress towards the SDGs. So our recommendation to the city is going to be, this is sort of the sneak preview, but we've already said it a number of times, is that we would really love to work with the city and other actors to identify what should be the targets for Winnipeg. I'll stop there. Sorry again that I couldn't do the live presentation, but hopefully you'll have a chance to take a look.
Not at all. Thank you for sharing the link and sharing more about Winnipeg's experience. It really touches on so many of those 10 ideas that are explored in the guide. We're now going to move to Liliana Diaz, Scientific Coordinator at the Institute for Environment, Development and Society, EDS Institute with Université Laval, to hear about some of the work happening in Quebec. Oh, you're on mute, Liliana.
Sorry, can you see my screen?
Yes, great.
I'm very happy to be here and to share with you all the work that we are doing at the Institute. I'm talking from Quebec City. And I want to, As a member of Université Laval, I would like to mention that in a spirit of friendship and solidarity, Université Laval pays tribute to the first peoples of these places, and being at the crossroad of Niuwentsiu, Kaknakina, Nitaskinan, and Wolastukuk, we honor our relationship with each other. And I am happy to share with you the work at the Institute in Environment, Development and Society. And perhaps to start to explain what we do, what we are. The Institute is like an interface between faculties and disciplines, and between academia and society. And we use SDG approach for some years to help to understand links between what we are already doing and identifying what needs to be done. And we play a role in representing university and different partnerships. And we are very happy to be part of this partnership with Tamarack Institute, because we know that only by working together, we will be able to provide the necessary efforts to achieve the changes we are aiming for. And we are starting to build an observatory on SDG governance, because we think that the contribution of the academic sector is, among other things, to systematize knowledge and transfer in the broadest and pedagogical way as possible. And we want to better play this role, and that's why we're starting the construction of that observatory that has many components. We realize that all sectors need to define a specific way to integrate SDG, and university and academia can play an important role to support them. Then one of the main components is localities and municipalities that you know, and our colleagues before have explained the different roles that can be played by municipalities, and that SDG can only be achieved through local actions. And through our observatory, we would like to offer to share all these tools, like the guide that's launched together, that is launched today, and to offer them in a bilingual tool, in a bilingual way. You know that the Université Laval is the first Francophone university in North America. Then we need to share all this conversation with Francophonie. And the other aspect is to identify data gaps and sources for local monitoring of SDG indicators, and to carry some comparative analysis of SDG integration, because we think that by analyzing, we can better advise localities. And we are asking a number of questions to better understand different approaches. And I can share with you an overview of these approaches that we have identified. You have today very extraordinary examples that we have in the guide, and they are all sharing a part of a common vision in which community planning is very central. Then you are invited to examine this in a more specific way in the guide, but I want to mention particularly the target of the grid, the target prioritization guide grid that is used almost in the Francophone. And that's the reason when it's not mentioned in the English version. But I am happy to announce that we are working with the Institut de la Francophonie pour le Développement Durable to make it also available in English in a near future. And you also have another kind of approaches that are not mentioned in this version, but perhaps in a future version of the guide, that are more focused on indicators. And we are working with all these approaches. And what you can see here is that all the approaches can contribute to a cyclical planning exercise and be used in a complementary way. And you can see that it's very important to understand voluntary local reviews, not only as a diagnostic exercise, like it has been used until here, but also like Winnipeg can use that an accountability tool, and it can be used at different moments of this cyclical process. I invite you to consult the guide and to join the community of practice. And through this community, we will certainly soon disseminate the activities and the results of our project. And in the meantime, you can consult our activities in our website, and or to contact me, I will be happy to share other information.
Merci, Liliana. Thank you. Just a quick reminder, if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A. We will get to them. If we not today, what we'll do is follow up with the panelists and send the responses out in our follow-up email. So please do put them in, even if we don't have time to get to them today. We're now going over to Luis Patricio, who is the SDGs Cities Project Co-Lead with Pillar Nonprofit, to hear about some of the work happening in London.
Thanks, Laura, and I'll try to be brief because the Q&A, it's always the most exciting part for me. So London, Ontario is a mid-sized city with almost 400,000 people, and it's like midway between Detroit and Toronto, just to sit where we are. And we are located in the traditional land of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape people, the regional caretakers of the land. And currently there are 3 nations that are sharing this land with us: the Chippewa of the Thames, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. Thanks for having me here. So usually when I talk about sustainable development in London, I usually start this conversation with London for All initiative, and this is part of the 10 guide. So you can, anyone who wants to know more can refer to the amazing guide you guys put together. So this was a coordinated effort of government, community organizations, and businesses with the bold goal to end poverty in 1 generation. And we had 112 recommendations to address that. And we delivered on most of those recommendations. But I could start that conversation earlier because London did have a lot of very interesting plans. The London plan was acclaimed as one of the best city master plans in the country. We do have a climate emergency declaration. We have a community diversity and inclusion strategy. We have a homelessness and prevention local initiative. And this were the things that we learned as we shifted from that London for All initiative that is focusing on poverty, and we want to kind of integrate our social, economic, and environmental challenges under one framework. And then we decided to use the SDGs for that. So that was one of the learnings, is all those different initiatives and local plans that were already in place. And on top of that, we had extensive community consultation with 60, we reached out to almost 100 people. We talked to 69 people with different perspectives on what we need to address. And one of the things that we learned is, at the high level, we are very much aligned with the SDGs, and who can argue that? We're talking about reducing inequalities and climate action, and all those things are clearly important for all of us. And when we dived into the specifics, we noticed that there was a need to address things a little differently in terms of how we're framing the issue, the language that we use, the indicators, the data that we have available, and even some gaps that are not in the original framework, which makes sense. We're talking about a global framework adopted by 193 nation states. So obviously, when we're talking a mid-sized city in Canada, there are some specificities. And I think that the other presentations alluded to that fact too, that we do need that adaptation, that localizing process that we're all referring to. And at the same time, I think one thread in our presentations is that we're not talking about reinventing the wheel. We're really leveraging the local priorities and the local initiatives that are already in place. But we wanted to connect that to the global challenges and really showcase how important it is to integrate those different initiatives that, even though they're addressing very important topics, I think this is our leap now moving forward for London and for cities around the world, is how to integrate, because we are already doing an amazing job. And that's why I'm so excited about Tamarack being in this space, because it's one of your roles is really this multi-sector partnership and collaboration. So I think this is our next leap, is to understand how to integrate those different initiatives under one single framework. Jane Engel, and you guys at Tamarack are probably familiar with her because she's McConnell and McGill when she's talking about sacred civics. And do I have it here? She's talking about the 4 accountabilities, right? She's talking about the accountability to future generations, to Earth, to the design world, and to all people. So all those global issues, they really require redefining the urban infrastructure. And many of those decisions and those actions to design and build that infrastructure actually lies with the local government and those local institutional infrastructures. So those complex issues, they really need to be addressed in a very customized, tailored way in cities that cannot be addressed alone by national policies. And I'm going to stop here because we're almost at 1, and maybe we can have some time to answer 1 or 2 questions at the end. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Luis. Yeah, we're just coming to a close soon, but let me ask you each, maybe in 1 sentence, what was the biggest challenge for you in your work on the SDGs locally?
Sorry, you cut a little bit for me, Laura. Can you repeat the question?
Oh, just what was 1 challenge you faced? Just in 1 sentence, what was the greatest challenge? What did you find the most difficult in your work?
I can start. In 1 sentence, I would say it's building partnerships and trust. That was the biggest challenge, but once you actually build it, you get so much more out of it, and you can, yeah, I would say it's the biggest challenge, but it gives you the most benefit as well.
So important, thanks. Who else would like to jump in?
Perhaps from our point of view, we are working with different localities that are in a different level of advancing. Perhaps you can are just starting, or you have a long experience in sustainability planning, and the main challenge is to find a specific entry point that can be important, enough important to all the participants, and to find the way in which SDG can be a contribution, but because contributions of SDG can be very different depending on your of the point in the process of you are, but to find it is really a great challenge to accompany different process.
Thank you, Stefan. Luis, in 1 sentence.
Yeah, go ahead. I'd agree with Kusum that building the partnerships definitely takes a lot more energy than we originally thought, and that it is also rewarding. I think I'd add to that maintaining momentum is a challenge as well. Often once you've achieved the level of awareness, there's a lot of enthusiasm, but then it tends to sort of wane after a few years, after 1 project cycle, and to sort of keep it going and to keep everybody engaged in the long run, I think is also quite challenging.
Mm-hmm. Luis?
Just building on that very quickly, I think it's part of it. It's the shared language. It is to really understand where different people are coming from and how to frame the conversation.
Thank you, everyone. We're right at 1 o'clock. We're wrapping up. I want to invite you to join a community of practice on SDG localization that we've just formed with SDSN Canada in partnership with them, and we'll be hosting a monthly meetings starting end of September this month. So please do check that out, and we'll be sending a follow-up email with the presentation, a link to the recording, and the resources shared today. Thank you once again for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time.